When we think of the Indian independence movement in the 1920s, the image that usually comes to mind is one of peaceful marches, homespun cloth, and civil disobedience. But beneath that quiet surface, a vicious economic struggle was tearing the country apart. The early 20th century saw India undergoing rapid, often brutal industrialization. Pioneers like J.N. Tata were determined to build modern, homegrown industries capable of competing on the world stage. The scale of this boom was massive. By 1907, Tata had established sprawling iron and steel plants, laying the groundwork for a manufacturing explosion that pulled hundreds of thousands of rural Indians into urban factories. Tying the subcontinent to the engines of global capitalism came with a severe risk. When the Great Depression triggered the collapse of financial markets in 1929, the shockwaves hit Indian shores almost immediately. India's export values crashed from over 300 crore rupees to just 132 crore in 3 years. For the workers in the textile and jute mills, this meant sudden, severe wage cuts, mass layoffs, and outright starvation. This widespread material suffering created an ideological void. The grinding reality of the mills proved that political sovereignty alone could not feed a family. The movement now required an entirely different kind of solution. Looking for a way to break that system, they found inspiration in the 1917 Russian Revolution. Communist ideology offered a highly specific blueprint for the working class to seize control of their own labor. By the late 1920s, a wave of organized strikes swept across the country. Workers walked out of the Bengal jute mills, the Bombay textile factories, and brought the massive South Indian Railway network to a grinding halt. The British administration was terrified. To crush the growing trade unions, they rammed through the Trade Disputes Act and the Public Safety Bill, getting the colonial government sweeping powers to arrest organizers on sight. The empire's goal was to quietly suffocate the movement in the dark. They rounded up socialist leaders across major cities, charging them with treason in elaborate, high-profile conspiracy trials meant to bury them in legal red tape. But by dragging these radicals into the public eye to destroy them, the British inadvertently handed the socialists the exact weapon they needed. The colonial government staged massive legal spectacles, most notably the Kanpur conspiracy case in 1924 and the Meerut case in 1929. The official charge was attempting to deprive the king-emperor of his sovereignty. They swept up prominent organizers of the radical left, like M. Singaravelar, a pioneer who had hosted the country's first May Day celebration and built early trade unions in the South. The accused realized they had a captive audience. Instead of pleading for leniency, they turned their defense testimonies into marathon lectures on Marxist ideology. Because the British courts operated on public record, regional Indian newspapers printed the revolutionary statements word for word. This entirely bypassed colonial censorship, delivering radical economic theories directly to millions of citizens. The Meerut trial dragged on for years and drew intense international outrage, with figures as prominent as Albert Einstein publicly advocating for the accused. The courtroom was built to silence the socialist movement. Instead, it acted as a giant megaphone, projecting their message louder than any street protest ever could. While intellectuals fought in the courts, an armed vanguard took that same megaphone strategy to the streets. This was the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, led by the young revolutionary Bhagat Singh. Singh had extensively studied the Russian Revolution. He concluded that random assassinations only isolated his group from the masses. Action had to be highly calculated, symbolic, and deeply tied to the workers' struggle. On April 8, 1929, Singh and a comrade threw 2 explosive devices into the Central Legislative Assembly, designed to create noise and smoke, but harm no one. They threw leaflets onto the assembly floor, shouted slogans, and then deliberately waited to be arrested. Once in custody, Singh mirrored the tactic of the communist organizers. He used the resulting Lahore conspiracy trial to broadcast his manifesto, demanding an end to the exploitation of man by man. This ideological fire spread rapidly. A year later in Bengal, a young woman named Kalpana Dutt joined a heavily armed guerrilla unit to directly attack the Chittagong Armory, severing British communication lines across the province. Young women taking up arms alongside men proved how deeply this ideology was penetrating Indian society, overriding traditional gender roles and regional divides. These calculated strikes shattered the illusion of British invincibility. More importantly, they handed millions of impoverished farmers and factory workers a clear, actionable ideology to rally behind. Pushed to the brink, the British Empire responded with lethal force. Bhagat Singh and his comrades were hanged in March 1931, while organizers like Kalpana Dutt were sentenced to life in exile. The colonial administration believed they had finally won. By cutting off the radical left and locking away survivors, they assumed the socialist threat was dead. They were entirely wrong. The ideas had already escaped the prison walls. By executing these young leaders, the British elevated them to the status of national martyrs. The hangings guaranteed that their radical economic demands would never be forgotten. They were now permanently etched into the core of the Indian independence movement. Just days after Bhagat Singh's execution, the Indian National Congress met in Karachi. Facing a public radicalized by the trials and crushed by the depression, the mainstream political leadership was forced to adapt. Under immense pressure from the left, the Congress passed a landmark resolution combining fundamental rights with a progressive economic policy, securing labor rights and pledging relief for debt-ridden farmers. The Karachi resolution formalized a crucial realization. Hauling down the Union Jack meant nothing if the new nation didn't guarantee economic justice for the people actually building it. When India finally secured its freedom, it was pushed over the finish line by the combined force of nonviolent protests and radical economic demands. These radicals successfully weaponized the tools of British oppression. By forcing their ideology into the courtroom and the public record, they ensured that India's eventual freedom would be defined by systemic rights for the poor, rather than a mere transfer of power between elites.